On a deck of the starship Sonata, Daniels took a sip of his water and glanced nervously around the table. At the left side of the table sat the Sauropotex delegation. These were large towering things, twice as big as he was. Humanoid, green, and reptilian. They were covered in scales, with bright multicolored feathers covering their arms and legs, and spoke in a series of hisses and rasps that sounded like a mix of trains and kettles. At the right side of the table was a giant tank of water that filled half the room, holding the Moran delegation. The Morans were cephalopodic, and a deep shade of violet. They were octopedal, bearing a great resemblance to the octopus of Earth. The Morans were interesting mainly because they didn't communicate verbally like Terrans or Zoroterics, a simple photo of living an aquatic lifestyle. Instead, they communicated visually through a combination of sign language and their ability to change color. Besides Daniel sat his interpreters. Alyssa was a former operatic singer with a gift for learning new languages. Her musical training allowed her to make some of the more unique vocalizations that the Zoroterics language entailed. Thomas was deaf, already well versed in multiple different sign languages. It gave him a good advantage at learning the Moran language. He was a mathematician by trade, which helped him decipher the Moran numbering system, which was in base 8 instead of base 10. Both Alyssa and Thomas had experience in the linguistics division on numerous diplomatic missions. That made them ideal for this unique mediation case. Mera was a world with a single small supercontinent. The majority of it was covered in a massive desert with multiple small tropical jungles on the southern edge. About 200 Earth years ago, the Zoroterics had begun colonizing the deserts of Mera. Back then, the Meran civilization was still confined to the oceans. The Merans have spent the majority of their history simply living in the water. The historians theorize that the Meran civilization began to first advance through discoveries made in air pockets in underwater cave systems. After all, things like fire and electricity cannot be manipulated underwater. When the Zoroterics began colonizing the supercontinent, the Morans were only able to colonize land over small, extra-aquatic distances, which had them limited to small islands scattered throughout the ocean, used as terrestrial bases for research and manufacturing. Within the last 50 years, the Merans had developed the technology to build large aquatic settlements on land, and with that had begun to colonize their planet's jungles. First contact between the Merans and Zoroterics occurred approximately 9 years after the Morans left the water. The initial excitement of the Merans at discovering a second intelligent species on their planet was quickly extinguished by the realization the Zoroterics were foreigners. The Merans believed in sovereignty over their territory, but the Zoroterics colonies had existed for centuries at that point. Hostilities broke out less than a year ago when the Merans launched water-to-surface missiles that destroyed the Zoroteric settlements. Since then, the surviving Zoroterics colonists had organized themselves into cells, sending raid groups to destroy any attempts by the Merans to expand past the jungle. When the Zoroterics homeworld sent additional reinforcements to Mera, that was when Earth stepped in to mediate a ceasefire for fear of an interplanetary war, dragging in the surrounding great powers. The Zoroterics delegation was massive. The 12 primary cells had sent lieutenants as representatives. How many cells there actually were, nobody knew, not even the Zoroterics themselves. Cells were constantly merging and forming. At the last count, Earth intelligence had determined that there were at least 27. In addition to the lieutenants, the Zoroterics homeworld had sent their Minister of War, and their Minister of the Colonies. The Meran delegation was equally impressive. In addition to the Minister of War and the governors of the 10 jungle-based colonies, the Meran Emperor has sent his war council, composed of top admirals representing the 4 subdivisions of the ocean. "I'd like to thank the Terrans for agreeing to host these peace talks," said Admiral Dorfellini, the representative of the colonial military stationed inside Colony 9. A particularly large cephalopod with a razor-sharp beak, which Daniels guessed he must sharpen regularly. He had a large green scar running across his head, one he'd earned during his first Zoroterics raid on his land. "Agreed. It is an honor to have the great peacemakers in our presence," hissed Lieutenant Varanus, the representative of the Trico cell. He had one lame arm and a single, very large gash on that same shoulder. Both injuries were from close combat with a Meran, most likely a neurotoxin-containing bite from a Meran beak. "It's my pleasure, gentlemen," said Daniels, making sure to sound as dignified as possible, even though it was Alyssa and Thomas doing all the speaking. "I hope that by the end of this summit we can agree on terms for a ceasefire. Now, let's begin. First, there was the matter of prisoners of war." "You mean Sorobteryx's prisoners," said Admiral Dolfini coolly. "Merans do not believe in being taken alive." "Our reports indicate that these things have captured thousands of our people," said General Varanus. "Nearly all of the non-combatants. We expect them all returned." "Regrettably, General," said the Admiral, "we cannot return many of them to you. Less than half have survived up until now." "And the rest you butchered like lab rats," roared the General, raising to his full height. "Of course not," said the Admiral. "Your people killed each other. Fighting was rampant in the prison camps, so much so that our guards found it impossible to stop them all." "You lie, Water Breather! You butchered them in your labs!" "Gentlemen," interrupted Daniels, "let's not dwell over suppositions and rumors. Currently there is no evidence for either of your claims. Let's simply limit ourselves to the facts. Now, Admiral, do you agree to return all Sorobteryx's prisoners, including the remains of the deceased?"
"Of course I do," hissed the Admiral. "After all, we are not animals like these beasts think we are."
"Wonderful," said Daniels, as he flipped through his papers. "Then that leads us to our next issue at hand. The Sorobteryx have agreed to halt their attempts to colonize the Meran jungles, but request that what remains of the existing colonies be allowed to remain."
"Unacceptable!"
roared the Admiral, as he turned a dark shade of red, expressing anger.
"No Sorobteryx must remain on Meran territory."
"Admiral, try to understand," said Minister Porassus, the first minister of the colonies.
"Our settlements are ancient. Most of the colonists were born in that desert. Even after your attacks on the cities, the survivors still want to rebuild. This place is home to them."
"This is not your land, mongrel," roared Governor Huplock of Colony 3. "You have no rights on this planet."
"Now you're being unreasonable," said Minister Porassus. "Our settlements are all within the most arid regions of your planet. Even with your recent advances, your people are unable to survive in a desert climate. What use do you have for 2 million kilometers squared of desert that is over 1,000 kilometers away from the nearest ocean?"
"We will not tolerate this attempt at passive invasion," said Governor Huplock. "If we allow any of your kind to remain, then we'll be negotiating another treaty in 100 years, when you decide to expand your territory."
"Well, Governor," said Daniels, "would you consider the possibility that—" Before Daniels could finish his thought, an explosion rocked the conference room. Daniels felt himself be thrown back against the wall as multiple sharp pains erupted in his stomach. When his head finally stopped ringing, Daniels looked up to a disaster. To his left lay what was left of the Sorobteryx delegation. One of the lieutenants lay motionless on the ground with a massive splinter of wood lodged above his right eye. The rest of the delegates lay around him, some screaming out in pain, others slowly trying to get up with not much success. To his right lay a shattered tank and a pile of flailing Merans, most of them missing limbs or with gashes in their heads. One by one they pressed a button on the backs of their heads, deploying emergency extra-aquatic suits. The suits erupted from a device lacing the backs of their heads, enveloping them each in skin-tight suits that began to fill with water, produced through a series of carefully controlled chemical reactions between components stored in the device and the air in the room. As Daniels continued trying to figure out what was happening, the doors to the conference room opened, and a team of Terran soldiers came rushing in. Daniels tried to get up, but was stopped by the sharp pain he had felt earlier in his stomach. He looked down to see large pieces of metal shrapnel sticking out of his abdomen, lodged just below his sternum. As if on cue, he spat up a puddle of blood and collapsed. The General Secretary of Earth, Dr. Victor Smith, stood looking out the window of his office. The ocean was crystal blue under a black sky of stars. A flock of birds flew past as he turned around to face the Supreme Commander of the Terran Army, General William Park. "Tell me again, General Park," said Dr. Smith. "The bomb detonated on the port side of the conference room. Seems like it was placed under the floor," answered General Park. "And the delegates?" "Both delegations suffered massive losses. The Sorobteryx lost the lieutenants of all 12 representative cells. The Merans lost the Minister of War, and 3 of the 4 admirals on their war council. The remaining members of both delegations are in critical condition.
And our own?
We lost all our representatives. It's a shame we had to send our 2 best translators.
You and I both know that was completely necessary. Otherwise, our efforts wouldn't have looked sincere. So what's the word from the Mirren and Sauroterix leaderships?
In the last 24 hours, we have received communiques from the Mirren Emperor and the leaders of 27 Sauroterix cells. All have declared a cessation of peace talks. Intelligence reports conflicts all along the eastern coast of the supercontinent, and radio chatter seems to suggest that the Mirren capital in the Southern Ocean has suffered a massive attack of some kind, but the details are vague.
Then the plan remains on track.
Absolutely, sir. Our projections maintain that both races should remain embroiled in the conflict for years. Neither should pose a threat to us. Dr. Smith stayed quiet for a second, as he turned back to his window, watching the waves crash on the beach. An unorthodox plan, to be sure, but these were still the 2 most aggressive races that Earth had ever encountered. Dangerously expansionistic and xenophobic. By pitting them against one another, Earth had ensured that they would not be a threat to anyone for the foreseeable future. It bothered him that the 3 dead humans never knew of his plan, but that didn't matter. Earth had to come first.